It was a sweet portrait of two girls, but the ribbon on their wrists reveals a dark truth. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of Amanda's late-grandmother's attic in Boston, casting long shadows across decades of accumulated memories. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, each one a time capsule waiting to be opened. Amanda had been avoiding this task for 3 months since her grandmother Dorothy passed away at 94, but today she finally found the courage. Dorothy had been a nurse, a woman of few words but profound compassion. She rarely spoke about her early career, deflecting questions with a gentle smile and a change of subject. "Some stories aren't mine to tell," she would say, her eyes distant. Amanda pulled open a leather trunk tucked beneath old quilts. Inside, she found stacks of sepia-toned photographs, their edges worn soft by time. Most showed groups of nurses in crisp white uniforms, standing before an imposing brick building. The structure looked institutional, austere, with bars on the upper windows that sent an involuntary shiver down Amanda's spine. As she sorted through the images, one photograph slipped from between the pages of an old journal and landed face up on the wooden floor. Amanda picked it up carefully, her journalist instincts immediately engaged. Two young girls, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, sat rigidly in wooden chairs. Their dark dresses were identical, buttoned high at the throat. Their faces held an expression Amanda couldn't quite name. Not sadness exactly, but an absence of emotion that seemed unnatural for children. What struck her most were the white lace ribbons tied around each girl's wrists, delicate and decorative against the severity of their clothing. Something about the image felt wrong. Amanda turned the photograph over. In faded ink, someone had written, "Millbrook Institute for Wayward Girls, Massachusetts, 1878. May God forgive us." The phrase sent ice through her veins. May God forgive us. Not God bless them, or in loving memory. Forgive us. Amanda held the photograph up to the window light, examining it more closely. The ribbons looked tight, perhaps too tight, and just below them, barely visible in the old photograph, the skin appeared discolored, darker than it should be. Her grandmother had kept this photograph for a reason, and that reason, Amanda suspected, was buried in a truth that someone had tried very hard to hide. She reached for her laptop. The investigation had begun. Amanda spent the next morning at the Boston Public Library, her laptop open beside stacks of historical records. The Millbrook Institute for Wayward Girls had existed from 1868 to 1923, 55 years of operation before closing abruptly. The official records were surprisingly sparse, just brief mentions in city directories and a few administrative documents. Wayward girls, the term made Amanda's stomach turn. In the late 19th century, that label could mean almost anything. Girls who talked back, who refused arranged marriages, who showed interest in education beyond what was considered appropriate. Girls who were simply inconvenient. She found a newspaper article from the Boston Daily Globe, dated September 1923. Millbrook Institute closes doors amid controversy. But the article itself was frustratingly vague, mentioning only administrative irregularities and concerns raised by former staff members. No details, no explanations. Amanda photographed the article and continued searching. In the Massachusetts State Archives database, she found incorporation papers listing the Institute's founding mission, to provide moral correction and domestic training for girls of troubled disposition and uncertain character. Moral correction. The euphemisms of the era couldn't quite mask what that meant. By afternoon, Amanda had created a timeline. She pulled out the photograph again, studying every detail under her desk lamp. The girls' expressions haunted her, that emptiness in their eyes, as if something vital had been extinguished. She used her phone to take a high-resolution scan, then uploaded it to her computer for enhancement. Zooming in on the image, details emerged that weren't visible to the naked eye. The ribbons weren't just decorative, they were covering something. Around the edges of the fabric, she could see marks on both girls' wrists, uniform marks. Circular patterns that suggested restraints had been there recently, perhaps removed just before the photograph was taken. Amanda's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the brightness and contrast. There, just visible beneath the younger girl's ribbon, was a dark bruise, partially concealed by the lace. She sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. This wasn't a sweet portrait, it was evidence. Evidence that had been deliberately hidden. Someone had dressed these girls, tied decorative ribbons over their injuries, and posed them for a photograph that would be sent to families or officials as proof of proper care. It was a lie captured in silver and paper, a performance of benevolence masking something far darker. Amanda needed to know their names. She needed to know what happened to them. The Massachusetts Historical Society occupied a stately building in downtown Boston. Amanda arrived when the doors opened, armed with her press credentials and the photograph carefully protected in an archival sleeve. The reference librarian, an older woman named Patricia with silver hair and sharp eyes, studied Amanda's request with interest. "Millbrook Institute," Patricia repeated, her expression shifting to something between concern and recognition. "You're not the first person to ask about that place. Follow me." She led Amanda to a climate-controlled room where older documents were stored. Most of the Institute's official records were supposedly destroyed in a fire in 1924, Patricia explained, pulling out a filing box. But we have some materials that survived, mostly correspondence, and a few personal items donated by families decades later. Inside the box, Amanda found letters faded and fragile. One, dated March 1878, was from a mother to the Institute's director. Dear Superintendent Clark, I write once more to inquire about my daughter Catherine's condition. It has been 8 months since her placement, and I have received only one letter which seemed not written in her usual hand. The photograph you sent shows her much changed. Please assure me she is receiving proper care and Christian guidance. The response, attached with a rusted paperclip, was terse. Madam, your daughter is receiving all necessary correction. Her progress is steady. Further correspondence is unnecessary and disrupts her reformation. Amanda's jaw tightened. She photographed both letters and continued searching. Another letter, this one from a father. Sir, I demand the immediate return of my daughter Mary. I sent her to your institution for discipline, not to be made unrecognizable. When I visited last month, she barely spoke and bore marks upon her arms that could not be explained satisfactorily. No response was attached to that one. Patricia watched Amanda work. There are rumors, she said quietly, passed down through families. Stories about girls who entered that place and came out different, broken. Some never came out at all. Amanda looked up. Do you know what happened to them? The official story is that the girls who died there succumbed to tuberculosis or influenza, but there were whispers about other causes, punishment that went too far, neglect. One former nurse gave a deathbed testimony in 1967, claiming she witnessed systematic abuse, but by then most records were gone, and everyone who could corroborate her story was dead. Amanda's grandmother had started working as a nurse in 1948. Did that nurse's name survive? Patricia nodded slowly. Margaret Chen. She worked at Millbrook from 1919 until it closed. Amanda sat in her car outside the Historical Society, her mind racing. Margaret Chen. The name meant nothing to her, but her grandmother had kept that photograph for 70 years. There had to be a connection. Back at Dorothy's house, Amanda returned to the attic with renewed purpose. The leather trunk yielded more treasures. Dorothy's nursing school diploma from 1947, employment records, and a small wooden box Amanda hadn't noticed before, tucked into a corner. Inside the box were more photographs, but these were different. Candid shots, not formal portraits. One showed her grandmother as a young woman, standing beside an elderly Asian woman in a garden. On the back, in Dorothy's handwriting, Margaret and me, 1968. She finally told me everything. Amanda's breath caught. Her grandmother had known Margaret Chen personally. Deeper in the box, she found a cassette tape in a plastic case. The label read simply, Margaret, October 1967. Her hands shaking, Amanda searched the attic until she found Dorothy's old tape player. She inserted the cassette, pressed play, and heard the crackling sound of old recording equipment, followed by an elderly woman's voice, accented but clear. My name is Margaret Chen. I am 79 years old. I worked at the Millbrook Institute for Wayward Girls from 1919 until its closure in 1923. I am recording this testimony because I can no longer carry this burden alone, and because the girls deserve to have their truth told. The voice paused, and Amanda heard a shaky breath. What happened in that place? What they did to those children? I was young and frightened, and I said nothing. I have lived with that shame every day since, but before I die, someone needs to know. Someone needs to bear witness. Amanda sat frozen, listening as Margaret Chen's voice continued, describing her first days at the Institute, the locked rooms, the sounds she heard at night, crying, pleading, sometimes silence that was worse than screaming. The photographs, Margaret said, her voice breaking. They would take photographs to send to the families. But first, they would prepare the girls, clean them, dress them, tie ribbons and bows to hide the marks, make them smile or sit still while the bruises were hidden beneath lace and lies. Those photographs were proof of nothing except our collective guilt. The tape continued for 40 minutes, detailing a system of abuse disguised as moral education, restraints used for behavioral correction, food withheld as punishment, girls tied to their beds at night to prevent escape attempts. When the tape ended, Amanda sat in the dim attic, tears streaming down her face. Her grandmother had known. She had carried this testimony for decades, unable to speak it aloud but unwilling to let it disappear. Now it was Amanda's responsibility to finish what Margaret Chen and Dorothy had started. Amanda spent the next 3 days immersed in research, barely sleeping, driven by the voices on that tape and the faces in the photograph. The Millbrook Institute had been run by Superintendent Howard Clark from its founding in 1868 until 1920. When his son, Jonathan Clark, took over for the final 3 years, the Clark family had been prominent in Massachusetts, respected, wealthy, connected to politicians and clergy. Howard Clark had presented himself as a reformer, a man dedicated to saving troubled girls through discipline and Christian values. Newspaper articles from the 1870s and 1880s praised his work, describing the Institute as a beacon of hope for families struggling with difficult daughters. But Amanda was learning to read between the lines of Victorian-era journalism. Firm guidance meant physical punishment. Strict discipline meant isolation and restraint. Moral correction meant breaking a child's spirit until they conformed. She found Howard Clark's published writings in a digital archive, essays and pamphlets with titles like The Necessity of Female Subordination and Correcting the Wayward Through Righteous Discipline. His words made her skin crawl. He wrote about girls as if they were wild animals to be tamed, problems to be solved through force and isolation. One passage stood out. The rebellious girl must learn that resistance brings only suffering. When she understands that submission is her sole path to relief, her reformation can truly begin. Photographic documentation of their improved deportment provides families with necessary assurance of our method's efficacy. There it was, confirmation of what Margaret Chen had described. The photographs were part of the system, tools of deception used to hide the truth from parents and authorities. Amanda found property records showing the Institute's layout. A main building with classrooms and administrative offices, a dormitory wing, and a separate structure labeled only as Correction Facility. That building had been demolished in 1924, the year after the Institute closed. Convenient. She discovered something else. Several former residents had died at Millbrook. Official causes included tuberculosis, influenza, pneumonia, and in 3 cases, complications from melancholia. Aye, but the death certificates were signed by the same doctor, Dr. Robert Ashford, who happened to be Howard Clark's brother-in-law. The picture was becoming clearer. Millbrook had been a closed system, protected by family connections and social respectability. Girls entered and either emerged broken or didn't emerge at all, and anyone who questioned the methods was assured by prestigious names and carefully staged photographs that everything was proper and necessary. Amanda returned to the original photograph. She still didn't know the names of the 2 girls, but she was determined to find them. Somewhere in the scattered records, their identities existed, and she would give them back their voices. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Amanda posted a query on a genealogy forum, asking if anyone had ancestors who had been at Millbrook Institute. Within 2 days, she received an email from a woman named Helen Barrett in Vermont. My great-great-aunt was sent there in 1877, Helen wrote. Family legend says she was never the same afterward. I have some of her belongings, including a small diary she kept hidden. You're welcome to examine it, if you think it might help your research. Amanda drove to Vermont the next morning. Helen was a retired schoolteacher in her 70s, living in a farmhouse filled with antiques and family heirlooms. She brought out a wooden chest containing her ancestors' possessions. Her name was Elizabeth Hayes, Helen explained. She was sent to Millbrook when she was 13 because she'd been caught reading medical textbooks. Her father thought it was inappropriate for a girl to be interested in such things. The diary was small, its pages yellowed and fragile. Elizabeth had written in tiny script, cramming as many words as possible onto each page. The entries were heartbreaking. January 1878. They tied Sarah and me to our beds again last night. My wrists are raw. Superintendent Clark says resistance is sin, that we must learn to be still and silent like proper young ladies. But Sarah keeps crying. I fear for her. Amanda's hands trembled as she read. Do you know who Sarah was? Helen shook her head. The diary mentions her often, but no last name. They seem to be close friends. Amanda photographed every page of the diary with Helen's permission. As she worked, more names emerged. Catherine, Mary, Rebecca, Anne. Elizabeth had documented what happened to each girl. The punishments, the isolation, the girls who simply disappeared from the dormitory one night and were later said to have died of illness. One entry from March 1878 made Amanda stop breathing. Today they took our photograph. They removed the restraints first and tied pretty ribbons over the marks. They told us to sit still and look calm, that this picture would be sent to our families to show we are well cared for. Sarah and I sat together. I tried to make my face empty so they couldn't see my hatred. The ribbon they tied on my wrist is the same white lace that covers the lie of this place. Amanda looked at Helen. Do you have any other photographs of Elizabeth? Helen brought out a small frame. The photograph inside showed a young woman in her 20s, standing stiffly, her expression guarded. But Amanda recognized something in the eyes, and that same emptiness she'd seen in the photograph of the 2 girls. This was taken about 5 years after she left Millbrook, Helen said quietly. She never married, never had children, lived with her sister until she died at 32. The family always said she died of pneumonia, but, Amanda prompted gently. My grandmother told me, years later, that Elizabeth had simply stopped eating, stopped speaking, just faded away, like part of her had died at Millbrook and the rest of her couldn't figure out how to live without it. Amanda felt tears prick her eyes. She thought of the 2 girls in the photograph, their faces carefully composed, while ribbons hid their suffering. She was now certain. One of those girls was Elizabeth Hayes, and she was determined to identify the other. Amanda returned to Boston with Elizabeth's diary and renewed determination. She contacted the Massachusetts State Archives and requested access to any surviving Millbrook Institute records, citing her press credentials and historical research purposes. 3 days later, she received permission to examine a collection of documents recently discovered during a building renovation, boxes that had been sealed and forgotten in a basement for nearly a century. The archive's reading room was quiet, except for the whisper of turning pages. Amanda opened the first box with gloved hands. Inside were intake forms, meticulously filled out in careful script. Each form documented a girl's arrival. Name, age, date of admission, reason for placement. The reasons ranged from heartbreaking to absurd. Excessive willfulness, reading inappropriate materials, refusing proposed marriage, unseemly interest in education, questioning religious authority, Girls as young as 11 had been sent away for behaviors that today would barely warrant a conversation. Amanda searched systematically, looking for 1877 and 1878 admissions. There, Elizabeth Hayes, admitted September 1877, age 13. Reason: unwomanly intellectual pursuits and disobedience to paternal authority. She kept searching. 2 entries later, she found it. Sarah Miller, admitted October 1877, age 12. Reason: hysterical temperament and defiance of maternal guidance. Sarah, the friend Elizabeth had written about so often in her diary. Amanda's hands shook as she photographed the intake forms. She now had names for both girls in the photograph, but she needed more. She needed to know what happened to Sarah Miller, whether she survived Millbrook or became another tragic statistic. In the next box, she found medical records. The handwriting was Dr. Ashford's, his notes brief and clinical. Most entries were formulaic. Administered correction. Patient responded to discipline. Behavior modification progressing. But one entry made Amanda's blood run cold. Sarah Miller, age 13. Continued resistance to institutional guidelines. Restraint measures increased. Patient exhibits signs of nervous exhaustion. Recommended extended isolation period. The date was April 1878, 1 month after the photograph had been taken. Further into the records, Amanda found a death certificate. Sarah Miller had died at Millbrook on June 15, 1878. Official cause: brain fever resulting from melancholic disposition. She was 13 years old. Amanda sat back, fighting nausea. Brain fever, the convenient Victorian diagnosis used to explain away deaths that were actually caused by neglect, malnutrition, or simply giving up on life. Sarah had died 2 months after sitting for that photograph, her wrists marked by restraints hidden beneath a white lace ribbon. But the story didn't end there. Amanda found correspondence from Sarah's mother, increasingly desperate letters demanding to see her daughter, questioning the explanations she received, threatening to involve authorities. The final letter, dated July 1878, was brief. "I'm informed my daughter is deceased. I demand her body be returned for proper burial and a full explanation of the circumstances of her death." The response, in Superintendent Clark's hand, was cold. "The child's remains have been interred in the institution's cemetery as per her father's consent. The matter is closed." Sarah's father had given consent, overruling her mother's demands. Amanda felt rage building in her chest. She had found the truth. Now she needed to tell it. The old Millbrook Institute property had been divided and sold decades ago. The main building had been demolished in 1952, and the land was now occupied by a small office park and residential development. But Amanda had found a reference in one of the letters to a cemetery located on the eastern edge of the property, beyond the apple orchard. She contacted the current property owners, and after explaining her research, received permission to search the area. The eastern edge was now an overgrown lot between 2 buildings, forgotten and neglected, surrounded by a chain-link fence. Amanda hired a local historian named Thomas, who specialized in lost cemeteries. Together, they pushed through brambles and wild growth, using old property maps to orient themselves. After an hour of searching, Thomas stopped and pointed at the ground. "Here," he said quietly. What had once been a cemetery was now barely recognizable. Most of the grave markers were gone, likely removed when the property was developed. But there, hidden beneath decades of leaf litter and soil, were the outlines of small stone markers, most broken or worn beyond legibility. Thomas used a soft brush to clear one of the few remaining stones. The carved letters were faint but readable. SM 1865-1878. May she find peace. Sarah Miller. No full name, no loving epitaph, just initials, dates, and a hope that death had brought relief from suffering. Amanda knelt beside the stone, her eyes burning with tears. 13 years old. Sent away for having a hysterical temperament, which probably meant she'd cried too much or expressed emotions her family found inconvenient. Restrained, isolated, broken, and finally buried in an unmarked grave where she would be forgotten. Thomas cleared 3 more stones nearby. 2 bore only initials and dates. One had no markings at all, the stone weathered smooth. "There are probably more," Thomas said gently. "The records show at least 12 girls died at Millbrook during its operation. Most of their graves are likely here, unmarked or lost." Amanda stood, looking at the forgotten cemetery surrounded by modern buildings where people worked and lived, unaware of the suffering that had occurred on this ground. She thought of Elizabeth Hayes, who had survived but spent the rest of her short life haunted by what she'd witnessed. She thought of the photograph, that carefully staged lie meant to hide the truth. She pulled out her phone and took pictures of the cemetery, documenting every visible stone, every indication that this place had been a burial ground for children. "What will you do with this?" Thomas asked. Amanda looked at him, her jaw set. "I'm going to make sure Sarah Miller and all these girls are remembered. I'm going to tell the story that Howard Clark and his associates worked so hard to hide. These children deserved better in life. The least I can do is give them truth in death." She had names now. She had evidence. She had testimony from Margaret Chen and documentation from Elizabeth Hayes. Now she needed to write the story that would finally break the silence. Amanda spent 2 weeks writing the article, pouring everything she discovered into a comprehensive investigation. She titled it, "The Ribbon and the Lie: How a Massachusetts Institution Abused Girls for Decades While Hiding Behind Respectability." The piece opened with the photograph. Those two young girls, their expressions empty, white ribbons tied around their wrists. She described the moment she'd discovered the truth beneath those ribbons. Marks of restraint, evidence of systematic abuse, proof of suffering hidden behind Victorian propriety. She told Elizabeth Hayes' story, using excerpts from the diary with Helen Barrett's permission. She told Sarah Miller's story, documenting her death and unmarked grave. She included Margaret Chen's testimony, her grandmother Dorothy's role in preserving it, and the pattern of abuse that had been allowed to continue because the perpetrators were wealthy, connected, and trusted. The article detailed how the Clark family had used their social position to silence concerns, how Dr. Ashford had provided medical cover for deaths that should have been investigated, how parents who questioned their daughter's treatment were dismissed as hysterical or overly emotional. Amanda included the other names she'd found: Catherine, Mary, Rebecca, Anne, girls whose only crimes were curiosity, intelligence, independence, or simply being inconvenient to their families. She described the correction facility that had been demolished so quickly after the institute closed, the records that had been destroyed, the conspiracy of silence that had protected reputations while sacrificing children. She sent the article to her editor at the Boston Globe's investigative unit. 2 days later, she received a call. "Amanda, this is extraordinary work," her editor Mark said. "But you know this is going to upset people. The Clark family still has descendants in Massachusetts. Some are prominent citizens." "I know," Amanda replied. "I've documented everything. I have primary sources, photographs, testimony, death certificates. The truth is the truth, regardless of who it upsets." "Then we're running it. Front page, Sunday edition." "Are you prepared for the backlash?" Amanda thought of Sarah Miller's grave, of Elizabeth Hayes' haunted eyes, of her grandmother Dorothy keeping Margaret Chen's testimony safe for decades. "I'm prepared," she said. The article published on Sunday morning. By noon, Amanda's phone was ringing constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Historians offered additional information. Genealogists contacted her with more names of girls who had been sent to Millbrook. But most moving were the messages from descendants, people who had family stories about great-great-aunts or distant relatives who had been sent to the Institute and returned changed or never returned at all. One woman wrote, "My great-grandmother was at Millbrook in 1881. She never spoke about it, but she kept a small white ribbon hidden in her Bible until she died. I never understood why until I read your article. Thank you for giving her silence a voice." The Massachusetts Attorney General's office announced they would investigate whether the unmarked graves constituted a crime scene. The Massachusetts Historical Commission designated the former Millbrook property as a site of historical significance. A local group began raising funds for a memorial. Amanda stood in her grandmother's attic, holding the original photograph. She had given Elizabeth Hayes and Sarah Miller their names back. She had exposed the lie behind the ribbons. She had fulfilled the promise her grandmother and Margaret Chen had kept for so long. The sweet portrait of two girls had finally revealed its dark truth, and in doing so, had brought light to a history that had been buried too long in shadow. 6 months after the article published, Amanda stood in a cold November drizzle at what had once been the Millbrook Institute grounds. Around her gathered nearly 200 people, descendants of girls who had been sent there, historians, advocates for child welfare, journalists, and community members who had been moved by the story. A memorial had been erected at the site of the old cemetery. It was a simple granite monument, but its inscription was powerful. "In memory of the girls of Millbrook Institute, 1868 to 1923. They were sent here to be corrected. They deserve to be cherished. May their stories never be forgotten." Below that, carved into the stone, were the names Amanda had been able to identify: Sarah Miller, Elizabeth Hayes, Catherine Walsh, Mary O'Brien, Rebecca Thompson, and 23 others. For the girls whose names had been lost, the memorial read, "And for those whose names we do not know, you are not forgotten." Helen Barrett stood beside Amanda, holding a framed photograph of Elizabeth Hayes. "She would have wanted this," Helen said quietly, "to be remembered not as a wayward girl who needed correction, but as a child who deserved protection." The ceremony was brief, but deeply moving. A local minister spoke about remembrance and justice. A children's choir sang. Several descendants shared stories about their ancestors. Painful stories, but stories that needed telling. When it was Amanda's turn to speak, she held up the original photograph, now encased in archival glass. "This photograph was meant to be a lie," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet crowd. "It was meant to show families that their daughters were well cared for, that the Millbrook Institute was a place of reform and redemption. But what it actually shows us, when we look closely enough, is the truth beneath the surface. Those white ribbons weren't decorations, they were cover-ups. And these girls' faces show us what happens when children are treated as problems to be solved instead of human beings to be protected." She paused, looking at the faces gathered before her. "My grandmother, Dorothy, kept this photograph for 70 years because she knew someday someone would be ready to see what it really showed. Margaret Chen gave her testimony because she believed the truth mattered more than her own comfort. Elizabeth Hayes left a diary because she wanted the world to know what happened behind those walls. We cannot undo the harm that was done here. We cannot bring Sarah Miller back to life or give Elizabeth Hayes the years she lost, but we can remember. We can bear witness. We can make sure that no child's suffering is ever again hidden behind ribbons and respectability. After the ceremony, people lingered, placing flowers at the memorial, talking quietly, sharing stories. Amanda noticed an elderly woman standing apart from the crowd, staring at the monument with tears streaming down her face. Amanda approached gently. "Are you all right?" The woman turned. She must have been in her 80s, her face lined but her eyes sharp. "My name is Ruth," she said. "Ruth Clark." Amanda's breath caught. Clark, the family name of the Institute's superintendents. "Howard Clark was my great-grandfather," Ruth continued, her voice shaking. "I've spent my whole life hearing about what a great man he was, what important work he did. And then I read your article." She wiped her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I'm so deeply sorry for what he did, for what my family did. These were children, and he destroyed them." Amanda took Ruth's hand. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for saying that. I'm adding money to the memorial fund," Ruth said. "And I'm going to make sure my family's historical records, everything we have about Howard Clark and the Institute, are donated to the state archives. No more secrets, no more hiding." As the crowd dispersed and the drizzle turned to steady rain, Amanda remained at the memorial, thinking about the long arc from 1878 to this moment. A photograph had hidden the truth for over 140 years. But truth, she had learned, has a way of surfacing eventually, especially when there are people willing to look closely, to ask uncomfortable questions, to refuse to accept comfortable lies. She thought of her grandmother Dorothy, who had carried Margaret Chen's testimony like a sacred trust. She thought of Elizabeth Hayes, who had documented her suffering even when no one wanted to listen. She thought of Sarah Miller, who had died alone and been buried without ceremony in a forgotten grave. They had been silenced in life. But now, finally, their voices had been heard. Amanda placed a white ribbon at the base of the memorial, not to hide anything, but to remember, to acknowledge that sometimes the sweetest portraits contain the darkest truths, and that our responsibility is not to look away but to look closer, to see what others missed or chose to ignore. As she walked back to her car, Amanda glanced back one final time at the memorial, at the names carved in stone, at the flowers already accumulating at its base. The girls of Millbrook Institute were forgotten no longer. Their story had been told. Their truth had been revealed, and their memory would endure, a reminder that every child deserves protection, compassion, and dignity. Not correction, not restraint, not ribbons tied over wounds to hide the evidence of suffering. That was justice. Imperfect, belated, but finally undeniably real.